profesores, funcionarios y alumnos de nuestra universidad. A continuación, el director de la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad Católica, Osvaldo Larrañaga, presentará a nuestra conferencista.
Muchas gracias, muy buenas tardes. Para nosotros, en la Escuela de Gobierno, es un honor en conjunto con la Vicerrectoría Académica organizar esta charla magistral de Ngaire Woods. Ella viene a Chile, entre otros motivos, porque mañana es la inauguración o presentación oficial de la Escuela de Gobierno. Va a haber otra charla magistral a profesores de la universidad y distintos tipos de invitados. Ngaire es actualmente decana de la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad de Oxford. No solamente eso, sino ella es la primera decana, la decana fundadora de esa escuela. Ella tiene estudios de pregrado en Nueva Zelanda, tiene un bachelor en economía y un bachelor en derecho, y después tiene una maestría y un doctorado en relaciones internacionales en la Universidad de Oxford. Ella ha trabajado, digamos, en la academia, ha publicado distintos libros e y artículos en revistas especializadas. Su especialidad es, globalización, sobre lo cual va a estar hablando hoy día, el rol de cómo se gobiernan las organizaciones, el tema del orden económico mundial hoy día y, en general, temas de desarrollo internacional y global. También ella ha trabajado o pertenece actualmente a distintos directorios de fundaciones internacionales y de organizaciones internacionales, incluyendo algunas de Naciones Unidas. Y para nosotros, nuevamente, ¿verdad?, es un gran honor tenerla a ella. La organización de la charla es, ella va a dar una conferencia, unos 30 minutos más o menos, y después la idea es tener un espacio de preguntas y respuestas de ustedes. Ustedes pueden hacer las preguntas en español o en inglés, como prefieran. Si hablan español despacio, ella puede entender, si no, una persona de nosotros va a asistirla a ella en la traducción, y ustedes también tienen la posibilidad de escuchar la charla en español en sus aparatos de traducción. Bueno, sin más, dejo con ustedes a Ngaire Woods. Porque pido un aplauso.
Thank you, and good afternoon. And it's such a pleasure to be back in Santiago. Last time I was here was 1 month before your last election, and I just realized yesterday that I had arrived almost at exactly the same moment before the forthcoming election. So it's interesting to be here at this moment thinking about globalization and democracy. I called this talk, Is Globalization Killing Democracy? Because we're living at a moment when in many parts of the world, people are either arguing that we've got to stop globalization, or they're arguing in some parts that we have too much democracy. And so it's this curious moment where people are thinking, you've got to kill one or the other. And I think we've got to think about the relationship between the two. Now, the question today is globalization killing democracy? Before we start investigating the assassin, as it were, let's think about whether democracy is in trouble. So what do you guys think? So I'd like you to put up your hand if you think democracy is in trouble, or if democracy is dying somewhere in the world. How many of you think that? Democracy is in trouble? So a strong faculty voice, and then a few students. So how many of you think that democracy is not in trouble? Okay, now that's, too many of you are not thinking at all. Okay, so we're gonna do this again. You've got to vote one way or the other. Okay, so how many of you think democracy is in trouble? Oh, wow. Okay, how many of you think democracy is not in trouble? Okay, so the brave man in the middle, right? Okay, so I might join you at the end, you know. So quite a lot of you think democracy is in trouble. Just give me a sense of why. I'd like to hear from 2 or 3 of you. Give me an example of where democracy is in trouble. Okay, I'm going to have to choose somebody. Yes, you. Gentleman, yeah, over there. Whoever you think I'm pointing at. In my own school, I know everybody's name. So up here, come on. What brave person is going to give us a comment up there? Yeah, you.
Why democracy is in trouble?
Yeah. Or give me an example of where you think democracy is in trouble.
Well, I would say a big issue has to do with inequality,
Mm-hmm.
and another has to do with representation. People don't really feel represented.
Mm-hmm.
I would say those are 2 issues which can be.
So that's leaping to why, that's great, that's why democracy is in trouble. But I guess it's interesting to think about first, what are the symptoms that it is in trouble, right? Yeah.
I think democracy is in trouble with the rise of lots of nationalist invasions. I mean, what's happening in the United States now with the cancellation of the DACA program and everything that's going on with Trump, I think that's a big symptom that democracy is definitely in trouble. Well, with Brexit as well, and all the anti-immigrant sentiments that are going on now. So.
Okay, right, so let's think about 2 indicators of whether democracy is in trouble. So one that's being felt worldwide are all the surveys, Edelman, Pew, the OECD, that tell us that trust in government is reducing at an alarming rate. So in Chile, in 2007, I think it was, let me check the figure or I'll get it wrong for you. Yeah, 43% of Chileans in the OECD survey in 2007 said they had a high level of trust in government. And by 2012, it had gone down to 32%. Okay, so from 43% down to 32%. That's quite significant when you look at trust barometers around the world. More sobering is the Edelman Trust Survey, which shows us that in 3/4 of the world now, 3/4 of the countries of the world, less than half of people have trust in government. Now that's dramatic when you take that country by country and compare it to, say, 20 or 30 years ago, when the trust figures were the exact inverse. So it's something that we have to take seriously. But then there's the point that your colleague made about the revolt, what we're seeing in elections, which we have to take seriously, which is a revolt against the establishment and against the core institutions of democracy. So let me just highlight that when I talk about democracy today, I'm talking about 4 things. Obviously, the elections, the electoral process is an important part of democracy. It's, if you like, the easy part, and we'll come back to that later. But the second part of democracy that's crucial is the sense of a rule of law. The rule of law meaning an independent judiciary. If you think about the historical rise of democracy, it was constraints on executive rule, and particularly the capacity of a king to order that you be killed. And so you get the rise of a rule of law and independent judiciary where everybody is under the same law. And that's the next element of democracy, equality under the law, which means a protection of minorities and a sense of equal formal status under the law, which we're also seeing an onslaught against. And then finally, the institutions of democracy, the institutions of government, the referees in society, and a belief that those institutions are in some way fair. And what we've seen, whether it's in the Philippines, in Venezuela, in Hungary, in Poland, in the United States presidential campaigns, and alas, in the subsequent rhetoric of the elected president, we're seeing, and in the far-right parties that are emerging in all of Europe's elections, we're seeing an onslaught onto those elements of democracy. And I want to be quite precise about that, because people are talking about populism and using it to mean all kinds of things. But when I speak today about a revolt against democracy and the role of the far right in that. I'm talking about a direct challenging of the rule of law, the fairness of the institutions of government, the legitimacy of the electoral process, and the principle of equality under the law, okay? Because I see those as fundamental to democracy. So when we think about, so I think now we've got to think about what's the relationship between globalization and the revolt that we're seeing across so many countries. Because it wasn't supposed to be like this. I want to just take you back in time for a moment to the 1990s, when the Cold War ended and the world thought that the market liberal democracy had triumphed, that the alternative models had been discredited forever. We were at, as one scholar put it, the end of history. So the market liberal democracy was seen to go hand in hand. Democracy and a liberal globalizing capitalism were seen to go hand in hand. And of course, throughout the 1990s, they did seem to go hand in hand because it was a period for most countries of economic growth that permitted an ongoing process of liberalization that accelerated through the 1990s. So that at the beginning of this century, particularly in finance, we saw a globalization that was unprecedented, with an exponential increase in global capital flows and in arrangements to remove boundaries on trade and on investment and different kinds of capital flows. And with that, and I think this is for me, this is a very important feature, is that with that came a transformation of the international organizations that had been created to manage globalization. So let me just take you back again a little bit further in history to the end of globalization. Let's not forget that from 1890 through to 1914, the world saw one of the most intense periods of globalization ever. And just as in the 1990s, people said there is no stopping globalization, people at that time said there's no stopping globalization. But then it came to a very abrupt end. 1929, Wall Street crashed, and a failure of governments to cooperate took Europe, the United States, the world into the Great Depression, and into, in many countries, a failure of democracy and a takeover by fascist forces and authoritarian government. And it was those lessons, and in particular the failure of governments to come together in the 1920s and to prevent beggar thy neighbor policies and to prevent the spiral down, that led to the creation of the post-Second World War order that most people in this room have lived through the legacy of. So the creation of institutions like the GATT and WTO, like the IMF and the World Bank, like the UN agencies and the United Nations system. But particularly when you look at the institutions that I've spent a lot of time working on, the IMF and World Bank, these were institutions created in the 1940s because the founders of the economic order recognized that there were great gains to be made from globalization, but there had to be quite a lot of protection in the system as well. And their vision of protection was to prevent capital flows and to preserve sovereignty over monetary policy. And so international organizations played this role of offering emergency assistance, of offering development funding when the market failed. They were playing a mediating role that helped mitigate the effects of globalization. But that all changed, and it changed in the 1980s. And those institutions, the very institutions that had been created to manage globalization, became, as I've labeled them, the globalizers. They became transmission mechanisms for yet faster globalization across the world. And that left a big hole in the system. So that once the system became truly tested, it was going to be difficult to see what institutions could help reinforce government's capacity to manage the crisis. But I'm going to get there in a moment. I just want to stay in that moment when globalization and democracy were seen to be running hand in hand, to remind you that at that time, lots of scholars pointed out that globalization was effecting a reduction of sovereignty of the state. So you tell me, how does globalization affect state sovereignty? Yeah.
If you think about like Facebook and how they can spread ideas and spread concepts beyond what a government can control, that would be an example.
Right, so activities outside of government control, because the Westphalian system, which some of you will have learned about, is premised on the idea of the state having exclusive control over a defined territory, or in the United Nations Charter words, political independence and territorial integrity. So think about what it is that's eating away at that. And your colleague is right, that one form is a ceding of authority to markets and permitting technologies to deterritorialize the economy in a way. And so it's not just Facebook, but even the core of sovereignty used to be monetary sovereignty, the control of your country's currency. Even that, with Bitcoin and currencies that are no longer controlled by any other states, we can see this deterritorialization. So that's one element of globalization. Give me another one. What else? Where else do we see sovereignty being eroded by globalization? Or let me put the question a different way. Where else do you see the sovereignty of one government being ceded? Any thoughts? Yeah.
When countries are in danger and institutions like the UN decide to intervene in them and they go past their sovereignty?
Right, absolutely. So there's another kind of ceding of authority, which is to other governments in a way, or to multilateral organizations, whether it's through trade treaties like NAFTA, or whether it's through regional arrangements like the European Union, or global arrangements. We can see that globalization means that states cede some authority to other states, or to groups of other states, or to multilateral organizations. Any other ways that they cede authority? Yes?
I don't know if it's the right way to say it in English, but transnational enterprises?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because sometimes they have a lot of power in countries, especially in third world countries, and they can, in a way, take over power from the state.
Great. And since 1990s, that's been a process which has accelerated. So let me give you two examples of where governments are ceding authority to firms and to private processes. So one is the Basel II Accord, which is on financial regulation, which basically permitted banks with international operations to begin to use their own models to define how much at risk they were. In other words, it transferred to them the absolute core of regulation. A second example lies in bilateral investment treaties, which give power to private companies to bring actions against governments and therefore cause governments to have to abide by arbitration decisions which lie beyond the government or the state. So my point here is that globalization does involve ceding authority, but note that it affects all governments. That's not just affecting democracies. So it doesn't tell us that globalization is killing democracy. It's simply telling us that globalization does start changing the sovereignty of the state, or diluting it, or causing some ceding of sovereignty of the state. So to understand the role of democracy, we've got to go further. And so I think the next step in the argument has to be, when did this argument suddenly start really gaining speed? And I think the 2008 financial crisis is the pivot point. And it's a pivot point because just as 1990 was the victory for market liberal capitalism, 2008 in many parts of the world, particularly, for example, in China, is seen as the collapse of the victors, right? So the countries right at the core of the market liberal democratic model. In 2008, I like the expression that a Chinese regulator used speaking at the school, and he was asked about the crisis, and he smiled and simply said, in China we have a proverb, when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. And they have a very diplomatic way of turning phrases. But the point of that, you know, that's a very subtle way to talk about the way in which 2008 caused a collapse in confidence in the ideas that lay behind the kind of market liberal capitalist victory. The victors were suddenly put on the back foot. And I think that the immediate causes of the 2008 crisis, some would call it the 2007 crisis. It depends whether you start the crisis in Paribas in France or whether you go to the British Northern Rock failure or the Lehman Brothers failure in the United States. But that financial crisis at the core caused, as you will know, an immediate reversal of capital flows. It caused the fastest and most severe shock to world trade ever in all the data that we have on economic history. And it caused a collapse in commodity prices, which had immediate ramifications, for example, for countries across the Arab world, whose governments immediately found themselves challenged because they could no longer live up to their promises to their population without oil revenues. So why is that then a challenge particularly to democracy? I've just mentioned countries to whom it's not a challenge. So the next step, as it were, in the argument is to take seriously the work on financial crises and their effects on democracy. There's a very good piece of research that looks at 20 advanced industrial democracies, 800 elections in them from the 1870s through to the current day. And the finding from that research is that the one consistent effect is an increase by an average of 1/3 of the voting share of the far right. In other words, when a democracy has a financial crisis, one of the immediate effects is the emergence or the immediate strengthening of the far right. That is to say, of forces that want to overturn the system. And that is, of course, exactly what we've seen across Europe and in the United States. The other finding that scholars have come up with is that the effect of the financial crisis is also to weaken further institutions, to fragment the parliament, to weaken the institutions. On the positive side, well, it depends where you sit. On the negative side, they find that if economic conditions stay depressed, the rise of the far right will continue unabated. In other words, the only way to stop that cycle is to actually improve economic growth. And that's where, I think, we see globalization and its effects starting to really cause problems for democracy. It's as we've seen financial crisis lead to economic decline that we're pushed now to look at what's been the effect of the globalization we've seen on the capacity of governments to respond. And that's the argument that I'd put to you today. And notice that when we look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, there are two countries at the top who are doing very well. China, with 76% of the population trusting the government, and India, with 75% of the population trusting the government. And what China and India share is that they've both continued on a path of economic growth. They're both in the fastest growing economies of the world. So they've continued economic growth, Indeed, even the Philippines is up there in that same trust bracket, not measured by Edelman, but measured by Philippine survey organizations. So the relationship between economic growth and trust in government is a really important component of this. But that's not very helpful if you're in a country that's not growing, in which the far right is increasing in strength. And that's the position of a very large number of countries in the world. So that takes me to the final part of my argument, and then I'd like to come to you for questions, which is that what globalization has revealed is something about democracy. And it's a point that Frank Fukuyama and others make, I think, extremely well, which is that the easiest part of democracy, as I said at the outset, is elections. And since the 1990s, we've seen elections take off. Across every continent of the world, we've seen countries have elections. That, for some, it's been difficult to get to elections, but it's still, even in those difficult circumstances, the easy part of democracy. And we can see that in Kenya, we can see it in Myanmar, you can see it in Nigeria, you can see it in Venezuela, right? Holding an election is the easy bit. What are the difficult parts? The most difficult part of building democracy and strengthening it is actually building state capacity. It's building the institutions of government so that the whole of the population, whatever their interests, whatever their ideology, trust those institutions to act fairly, to act impartially, and to act efficiently. And that's the difficult part of democracy. Now, what's happened, and this is where I think we do have to look back at globalization, is that globalization was accelerated in a framework, in an ideology starting in the 1980s that said that in order to globalize, you needed to roll back the state. In order to globalize, you needed to reduce the role of the state. You needed to reduce state capacity. The most absurd extreme of this was when the president of the World Bank was visiting West Africa and was informed rather cheerfully by the president that was showing him round, this is my civil service. They are now almost entirely self-financing. And that was seen as a good thing, a self-financing civil service. What are we talking about? How can you have a self-financing civil service? What does that mean? What do you think it means? What would it...
Corruption?
Right, exactly. A civil service living entirely off corruption, right? Which is not a civil service that is ever going to command the trust of its people or a sense of fairness and impartiality in the delivery of government. That's the extreme, but far back from that extreme, what we saw in the 80s and 90s as an attempt to rectify all the big government mistakes of the 1970s was an overcorrection and a hollowing out of the government institutions needed. So what we face now in Europe, in this continent, across Africa, across Asia, are countries grappling with a difficult world economy in which to try to grow, in which government no longer has the capacity boldly and effectively to undertake some of the moves they need to make in order to create the economic growth which will permit the political system to stabilize. And that's the way in which globalization has undermined and eroded some of the core elements that democracy needs. And that's why when people, I think there has been hysteria around the world about the new administration in the United States. But I think that some of that hysteria was well-founded in the sense, well-founded, it was understandable given that for the first time you had a president of a country which is emblematic with the rule of law for many, questioning the impartiality of the judiciary, questioning the legitimacy of core institutions of government, failing to condemn political violence, and explicitly tearing up ideas of equality under the law. They are important to democracy, and the narrative from the top about those core elements of democracy is equally a very important one. But it's not just from the top down, and that's really my point. it's not just a new president saying these things that tells us that democracy is in difficulty. It's the fact that they resonate so strongly across the population that we have to really pay attention. And finally, before we move to questions, I think where we now have to go in most of these countries, if we're going to reconcile globalization and democracy, is two things. One, we've got to rethink the role of governments and ensure that they are much better equipped to take counter-cyclical policies, to compensate for market failures, to mitigate when markets collapse. And that capacity has been lost. And it's that sense that led me at Oxford University to decide 10 years ago that we had to build a school of government. We had to build capacity across the world that can start improving government's capacity to respond to that. And second, we've got to look at the international. We've got to reinvent international institutions so that they can help governments actually do that. Because otherwise, why should we expect citizens to trust their governments to mediate and mitigate international forces if those very governments have neither their own capacity nor the support of international institutions to do so? So we learned in the 1930s what happens when governments don't or can't cooperate. And in the 2008 financial crisis, we had good news and bad news. The good news was in November of 2008, right after the crisis, when President George W. Bush brought together the G20 leaders, and they came up with a statement of cooperation, which prevented the world economy collapsing. That was huge. That act of cooperation did prevent what could have been quite a disastrous collapse at that moment. But already by November of 2009, that cooperation had collapsed. In the intervening period, Greece had gone into its own financial crisis. The Eurozone stood on the brink of a crisis, and suddenly the G20 countries all went their own ways, with the Europeans at the core and Britain in the lead, deciding instead of supporting global growth, to go the opposite way, to act with the markets, to contract government spending just as the markets themselves were contracting, and to throw not just Britain, but European countries doing the same into a rather vicious circle down. And we're now living in Europe with the consequences of that. And it's not just Britain with its Brexit vote. It's every country in Europe that is now facing a very strengthened far-right group of forces that is really challenging those four elements of democracy that I started out with. So I'm going to stop there to say globalization has weakened the capacity of democratic governments to respond to the crisis in which they find themselves now, but there is a route back. And that route is to really go back to the exercise of strengthening state institutions and then strengthening and reinventing the role of international institutions to support governments to do that. Your questions?
I'm not sure how to formulate the question, but we've seen in a lot of countries this attack on minorities. Do you think it has to do with the fact that because globalization is taking a little bit away the authority of nations are trying to redefine their identity, and that's why minorities are sort of like being attacked in some places or trying to find their own space in what the community of a nation means? Or is it sort of like a process that's been coming from a long time and just globalization has just sort of like put it in the center of news?
That's a great question, and the answer to that, in my view, is that there is a very powerful correlation between people's trust in government and the trust of communities across each other, or certainly in Europe, in European studies. And it comes to a specific kind of government capacity, and that's the role of the government in ensuring public spaces where citizens come together. And that's proving to be really critical. What we're seeing in country after country where the government has rolled back is the fragmenting of society into different communities and the increase in fear and lack of contact between those communities. In the Blavatnik School, we have a psychology professor that works on social psychology that looks at why it is that you can either be on a virtuous circle where communities do meet each other in their housing, in their schools, in their health centres, in public parks, And the more they interact with one another, the less they fear each other, and therefore the more they interact with each other. So that's the virtuous cycle. What we're actually seeing in many parts of Europe is the opposite, which is communities becoming more separate, public housing becoming more segregated, and a sharper and sharper cycle of fear and further fragmentation and segregation. So, for example, in Britain, one of the things that's been closed down by the government austerity program, which was a response to 2008, is early school, is preschool childcare centres, which used to bring different parts of the community together. And it's quite difficult to believe that a person that doesn't look like you has a 6-bedroom council house, which, by the way, doesn't exist in Britain, except in the tabloid press trying to whip up hatred, if you see them every day, right? If you see them every day, you have a reality check. In Britain, that's been lost. What we saw in the Brexit vote were communities incredibly fragmented and segmented. The opposite example to that is in Singapore, where in their public housing projects in Singapore, they populate their public housing in exact proportion to the minorities in their population. In other words, you live next door to communities which are not like your own, and therefore you have little chance to demonize them and become afraid of them. You very quickly realize that they, just like you, have the same issues and problems and challenges. And so housing, education, public spaces, public parks, all of these places where citizens come together and learn not to demonize one another and not to fragment into these different identities. And all of those initiatives are in the process of being rolled back as governments seek to balance budgets after the financial crisis.
Hello. So from trying to generate this, since the end of the Second World War,
Yeah.
this sort of supranational rule.
Yeah.
you know?
Great. Well, maybe I can answer that part of the question about regulation. And I'm really glad you asked it, because do not mistake what I'm saying to be an argument that governments should regulate everything. And again, banking regulation is a really, really interesting case. Because banks, of course, for the last 30 years have been hugely regulated. They've had huge compliance officers working on all kinds of things. They've been hugely regulated. They just haven't been regulated in Europe and the United States on the things that most matter, right? The thing that most matters in regulating banks is capital and leverage. So they've been regulated on all these other things. So they feel over-regulated, but they haven't been smartly regulated. And smart regulation is interesting because when I talk about state capacity, sometimes it's about the morale and boldness of the government. So in regulating banks, if we go back to before the crisis, what governments needed to be doing was quite simple and straightforward. And why do I say it's simple and straightforward? Because what went horribly wrong, one of the aspects of the financial crisis that the financial crisis revealed, was what happens when you permit investment banks to become limited liability companies, right? In other words, they can bet the bank. If they win, they keep the profits. And if they lose, society pays. It's a limited liability on the ownership of the bank. And when you take that model and then you permit that bank to decide itself, even though there's an implicit public guarantee, you let the bank decide how much capital it's got to keep, as per the Basel II Accord, then you get into a really dangerous situation where you've privatized the profit and socialized the risks. And if we look at that, and we look at the fact that there are unlimited liability banks in the world, there are banks to whom that doesn't apply in Brazil and in Switzerland. And if you ask what kind of capital do those banks have, in other words, when they know they're going to lose their own holiday homes if they go bust, what kind of provision do they make against their investments going wrong? It's somewhere around 13, 14%. So when the regulators who sit in the Basel Committee tell us that 9% is adequate, I don't believe them, because it doesn't pass the market test of what would the rate be. So why do I give you all that detail? It's to say that what was lacking in bank regulation is not some huge technical know-how. In fact, what Basel II did and what the banking regulation that preceded the crisis did was require governments, if they were really going to enforce their regulation, they would have needed as many people working in their regulatory agencies as they were working in banks. Just after the crisis, I hosted a meeting in Oxford of regulators and bank heads. Each of the banks had approximately 250 people, these were major global banks, working on trying to influence government regulation. And then we had the European Banking Authority that was supposed to be stress testing all of these banks. So guess how many people were full-time employed by the European Banking Authority in 2009-10? Okay, the banks have 250 people each. Mr. Enria had 6. Okay, so how do you, he did have secondments from different governments as well, but how is it that 6 people regulating can regulate some of the smartest, most informed, and highly paid people in the world who have a huge incentive to bend the rules, right? It doesn't make any sense. And nor does it make sense to say, therefore, governments need more and more regulators, pay them more and more, give them more and more information, because you're never going to win. And you'll end up with a hopelessly large government. What makes sense is simple regulation that puts the cost back onto the sector that's being regulated. In other words, a high capital standard. So the balance between regulation and capacity of the state is a really important one, and I'm not suggesting we need a huge regulatory state. I'm saying we need governments with the confidence to actually do simple, sometimes costly regulation to protect their citizens from market failure. Yeah. Is that what you were, was that your question? Yeah.
Si alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta en español también, por allá.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
You've talked about like recent globalization, but if you look like globalization back in the times of like monarchies, when you started like expanding all through the world, I only think, I don't know, that you could have seen a correlation between globalization and illustration and knowledge expansion and democracy. And people that revolutionized against, I don't know, like the French Revolution and things like that. And even if you go like nowadays, you can see people that are getting more informed from social networks and everything like that. So they can like expose what is being done badly from governments. So maybe like you could see it the other way around and say that globalization could make like better democracies and more informed people. And
you're definitely right that there are the two sides always in every period of globalization. I think it would be at the very best controversial to describe the creation of European empires as the democratization of the rest of the world. I think it was seen by most of the world as subjugation. But I think what you're getting at is that at the same time as you saw empires created and developed, you saw things like the anti-slavery movement, which was grassroots. If you think about Marcus Garvey and the anti-slavery movement pick up, that was the flip side of globalization, right? Which was contact across people, communication across countries, which permitted that movement to begin to snowball and to result in the ending of slavery. So yes, it's got both sides. And we're seeing both sides today, aren't we? Yeah.
Acá hay otra pregunta.
Yeah. So you discussed two mechanisms in which globalization affects democracy. One is the loss of power from states.
Yeah.
Another one is the role of financial crisis, for example. But I have the feeling that there is a third one that you didn't mention, but I would like to listen to your opinion about that, in which globalization directly affects democracy, even if it's working, if the economy is working correctly. And it is the distribution or the complementarity between low-skilled workers abroad and the capital in highly developed countries. So you have a lot of people that are owners of companies, for example, in the US or in the Western democracies, sending their work abroad. And of course, people in India, people in China benefit a lot from that. Of course, consumers benefit a lot from that. Of course, the owners of the companies benefit a lot from that. But there is this gap in which the low-skilled workers in the Western developed countries can suffer, right? And so,
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I should say that in part, my remarks today are a complement to the arguments about inequality, globalization, and democracy. You know, the American Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said, you can either have extreme inequality or democracy, but you can't have both. And what we're seeing, I mean, this wasn't the specific of your question, but the inequality and the sense of the 1% and the rest is clearly driving the forces. But the reason why I choose to make this argument is that in order to counter that, in order to actually provide a pathway away from the Piketty trajectory that we're on, requires governments to act. It's very interesting to me in this America-China debate about jobs that car workers in Detroit, who are almost all unionized, earn about $45 to $50 an hour. Car parts workers in Arkansas, where they deregulated, where they have almost no safety standards and they're only 9% unionized, earn $8.75 per hour. Now that's less than what car workers are now earning in China's export processing zone. Now that's interesting, right? China used to be the cheap workforce. America was the high-value workforce. So what we've seen is the development of a whole car parts industry, which is lethal in some states in the United States, where literally, where the serious accident rate is 50% higher than in any other car works, right? So this is less safe, it's longer shifts, and it's worse paid than some of the car factories in China. That's very interesting because it's telling us a story not about globalization, but about what governments are doing to either regulate or not to regulate, to permit unions or to permit other kinds of workforce bargains, to apply safety standards or not to apply safety standards. That's about government capacity. And that's why I think we've now got to think about what the government capacity is. And government capacity is not just how much money do you spend on government or how many people do you employ. It's also about ideas. It's about the aspiration of government, the belief in government, the morale of government. What do they believe they can actually do and what do they believe it's their duty to do? And that, I think, is where we are now on this debate about inequality. Well, can I just say a big thank you to all of you for listening to me in English, for asking your questions in English. It's a great kindness, and it's one that I am very grateful for. So thank you all for bearing with me on that.
Muchas gracias. Junto con agradecer la presencia de nuestras autoridades, de Ngaire Woods también, y de todos ustedes, los invitamos a la salida de este salón a un cóctel. Muchas gracias y buenas tardes.